"You'll have to wait outside, ma'am. This floor is reserved for executive appointments only." The receptionist's voice was dismissively polite as she gestured toward the cramped wooden bench near the elevators. Standing in the towering glass lobby of Sterling Civic Bank on a freezing Chicago morning was 52-year-old Evelyn Vance. She wore a simple charcoal wool coat, a plain knitted scarf, and carried a worn leather briefcase. Her eyes were quiet, steady, and filled with the calm composure of someone who had faced far colder storms than a condescending reception desk. Around her, young vice presidents and senior brokers in tailored suits glided past the security turnstiles with barely a glance. No one asked for their identification. No one questioned their right to be there. But when Evelyn had stepped up to the marble desk, the receptionist, a young woman named Brenda, had barely looked up from her computer screen before making her assumption. "I am here for the emergency board meeting on the top floor," Evelyn said softly, her tone carrying a natural authority that should have made Brenda pause. Brenda let out a small, quiet smirk, adjusting her headset. "Ma'am, the top floor is for the bank's major shareholders and the acquisition team. Unless you are here to clean the conference room after 12, you need to step back to the public waiting area." Two male executives standing nearby chuckled softly into their coffee cups. Evelyn didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand a manager. She simply walked over to the wooden bench, sat down gracefully, and adjusted the small gold watch on her wrist. She knew that in less than 15 minutes, the very executives laughing in the lobby would be begging for her mercy. To understand Evelyn Vance, you must understand the invisible foundations laid by Black women who built empires while the world refused to acknowledge their names. 30 years prior, Sterling Civic Bank was nothing more than a failing regional institution drowning in bad debt. Evelyn had started her career there as a junior night accountant, working 12-hour shifts in a windowless basement office. While the male executives on the upper floors made reckless speculative bets, Evelyn possessed an extraordinary mathematical mind. She quietly developed a revolutionary risk assessment algorithm that saved the bank from bankruptcy during the financial crisis of the late 1990s. Instead of promoting her, the bank's white male leadership took credit for her work, pushing her into early retirement with a modest severance package. But Evelyn didn't quit. She took her severance, invested every dollar into distressed urban commercial real estate across the Midwest, and spent 3 decades quietly building a vast private holding company known as Vance Global Holdings. She operated entirely out of the public eye, avoiding press interviews and fancy galas. While the leadership of Sterling Civic Bank spent decades boasting about their prestige, they had quietly accumulated massive debt to stay afloat. What Brenda and the executives in the lobby had no idea of was that 30 minutes prior, Vance Global Holdings had officially purchased 92% of Sterling Civic Bank's distressed debt, making Evelyn Vance the absolute majority owner of the entire institution. Up on the 65th floor, the grand mahogany boardroom was in a state of absolute chaos. The bank's chief executive officer, Richard Sterling, stood at the head of the table, his face pale and sweat glistening on his forehead. Surrounding him were 16 senior board members and lead attorneys, frantically shuffling through financial disclosures. "Where is the buyer?" Richard shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "The foreclosure deadline passed at 9 o'clock. If Vance Global does not sign the restructuring agreement within 20 minutes, federal regulators will freeze all assets and padlock this building by noon." Richard turned to his executive assistant, who was standing nervously near the door. "Has the representative from Vance Global arrived? Did anyone check the private landing pad, the VIP lounge?" The assistant stammered, pulling up the security logs on her tablet. "Sir, the private transport logged an arrival 20 minutes ago. The security feed shows the primary investor entered the building through the main lobby." Richard's eyes widened in horror. "Through the main lobby? Who is hosting them? Who is escorting them up?" A heavy silence fell over the boardroom as Richard realized no one had been sent to receive the most powerful investor in the city. He pushed past his chair, throwing open the boardroom doors, and sprinted toward the executive elevator bank alongside his entire board of directors. Down in the main lobby, Brenda was busy typing an email when the private executive elevator suddenly chimed with an unusual, frantic chime. The doors burst open, and CEO Richard Sterling rushed out, followed by a sea of anxious board members in high-end suits. Brenda immediately stood up straight, smoothing her skirt, assuming the CEO was coming to welcome an international delegation. "Mr. Sterling," Brenda called out with a bright, rehearsed smile, "can I help you find someone?" Richard didn't even look at her. His eyes swept wildly across the lobby, past the polished marble columns until they locked onto the simple wooden bench near the elevators. There, sitting quietly with her hands folded over her leather briefcase, was Evelyn Vance. Richard froze in his tracks, his face drained of all color as memories of 30 years ago came flooding back. Memories of a brilliant young knight accountant whose genius he had stolen to secure his first promotion. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Richard stepped forward, his knees visibly trembling as the entire board of directors followed him across the floor. Brenda watched in complete frozen horror as her CEO walked up to the woman she had just threatened to throw out, bowed his head, and extended a shaking hand. "Mrs. Vance," Richard's voice was barely a whisper, filled with deep humiliation and raw desperation. "Please tell me you haven't been sitting out here this whole time." Evelyn slowly stood up from the wooden bench, holding her leather briefcase. She didn't look at Richard with anger, nor did she gloat over the panic in his eyes. She looked at him with the cool, calm detachment of someone who held the fate of his entire legacy in her hands. "I was told, Richard," Evelyn said, her voice echoing clearly across the hushed lobby, "that this floor was reserved for people with executive appointments, and that those who don't fit your aesthetic belong outside." Brenda's jaw dropped. The two male executives who had chuckled earlier backed away into the shadows, their faces pale with embarrassment. Richard fell to his knees in front of the entire lobby staff, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "Mrs. Vance, I apologize. On behalf of the entire bank, please come upstairs. If you don't sign the papers, hundreds of employees will lose their jobs today." Evelyn looked down at him, her expression unchanging. She adjusted her plain wool scarf and walked past him toward the executive elevator. As she stepped inside the golden doors, she turned to face the entire lobby, the receptionist, the security guards, and the terrified board members. "Position does not give you privilege, Richard," Evelyn said quietly as the elevator doors began to close. "And arrogance will always cost you everything you built on someone else's back." The doors slid shut. Within 2 hours, Evelyn Vance signed the papers that restructured the bank, removed the corrupt executive board, and placed a new foundation of accountability in place. She walked out of Sterling Tower not as a forgotten employee, but as the owner of the house that once refused her a seat, proving to the world that true power never needs to scream to be felt.